Hi, I'm Nancy Gaucher, and I'm at the Canadian Science Policy Conference 2018 in Ottawa. And I'm here with Dr. Philippe van Cappellen. He's the Canada Excellence Research Chair Laureate at the University of Waterloo. Welcome, Philippe. Thanks for being here. So I saw you today on a really great panel. We were talking about science policy links and how it relates to water challenges in Canada. So maybe that's a good place to start. Like, tell me a little bit about what's happening around water issues in Canada, specifically around climate change and non-point source pollution.
So some of the biggest issues in terms of water in Canada have to deal with water quality, with the fact that we're seeing impacts on our waterways, whether it's rivers, lakes, estuaries. We start seeing a lot of changes taking place. They're gradual changes, but they imply that some of the water quality that we're dealing with are actually getting worse in certain cases. Obviously, a very good example is the recurrence of harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie, which we thought we had solved in the 70s by essentially limiting nutrient inputs to the lakes, but now they're coming back, and we think there's definitely a link with climate warming, for instance. And so as Canada grows in population, its economy is growing, there's more and more demands on water. In fact, for everything we do as humans, we need water, whether it's to produce food, in industrial processes, in our homes, we need water, and we need water of sufficient quality. And so I think the issues that we're facing in Canada have a lot to do with water quality and how water quality is changing and will change in the future, in part due to climate change, but also due to just demographic growth, land use changes, etc.
So when we're trying to figure out how do we fix these problems, all of these problems related to water and addressing these threats, you need both science and policy. But despite the fact that our scientists and our policymakers are sort of on the same page, we all have the same goal, we're trying to figure out the answers to these problems. But there's a disconnect between science and policy.
Yeah.
So what's going on there? What's happening?
Well, I think the nature of the problems that science could inform policy about have changed. In the past, we had some very clear issues that we could deal with. So for instance, I was talking about these harmful algal blooms. Well, in the 70s, we figured out that, hey, these were driven by excess nutrient inputs to the lakes, in particular phosphorus inputs. And so legislation was introduced to reduce these inputs. Wastewater treatment plants were built to deal with the point sources. And so the solution was fairly simple, or at least I wouldn't say simple, but it was fairly straightforward to have science inform policy. And so those were some very big successes. What we're dealing now is, of course, that we don't only have these nutrients anymore, we have these non-point sources, we have invasive species that are coming into our lakes, we have climate change, we have a lot of different stresses that are acting and that are influencing water quality. So the solutions are no longer clear-cut. The solutions are no longer, we don't have these easy fixes anymore. And so I think that's where a little bit of the disconnect comes, because we as scientists, we come forward, we say, okay, we have these multiple stressors, we have to look at how they interact, it might not be straightforward, we need adaptive strategies. So these are answers that sometimes on the policy side sound like, well, do you know what you're doing? Or do you have the knowledge? And I would say we have the knowledge, but we also need a response on the policy side that acknowledges the complexity of the issues that we're dealing with.
So you're at the University of Waterloo and working with a lot of students. As students we're trying to train them, we're teaching them about the hard science, but we also want to prepare them for this world where they're going to need to maybe work with policymakers and need to communicate with them. So what are the things that we can do in order to prepare our students?
Well, I think we need to prepare our students by making them aware of this science policy interface and the complexities associated with the science policy interface, that because you're doing good science, it does not necessarily automatically translate in better regulations or better policies, or even when we talk about adaptive management, it's not easy to implement necessarily. So I think our students need to be aware of it. They're the new generation of people who will have to deal with these complex issues. I think they're definitely, what I see among students is an eagerness to understand this science policy interface, and I think we need to make them aware of it. We need to make them aware of what the problems are, what the issues are in terms of translating knowledge produced by scientists to the users of that knowledge, and it's not just policymakers, it's also water managers. I think there's a lot that we can do in terms of making them aware of it, but also starting to teach them techniques or ways to basically do this knowledge translation from science to policy.
Right. And to get into science a little bit more, you know, one of the really inherent qualities of science is it's an uncertainty.
Yes.
You know, we're doing science and we don't always have a complete answer, a complete picture of what's actually happening there. But, you know, our policymakers need to make decisions with imperfect information. How can our policymakers understand what's happening or the uncertainty around science, and how do we work through that in order to ensure that our decisions are made informed by science, knowing that science isn't perfect?
Yeah, and I think that's important. And of course, as scientists, we always will say that we can make a prediction, for instance, but there's a certain uncertainty associated with it. I think there's a lot to do from the science community to basically inform what it means, what uncertainty means. Uncertainty doesn't mean that you don't know. Uncertainty means that you can actually quantify what might happen, what could be the potential envelope of possibilities in the future, for instance. But I think, in fact, we can also work by analogy. I mean, if you talk to the insurance company, well, the insurance companies, it's an industry that's based on dealing with uncertainty, and they deal with it very well. They still make a profit, for instance. So uncertainty is inherent, I would say, to life. Uncertainty is, I mean, we cannot predict how the economy will be 5 years from now. We cannot predict if there will be a conflict in the Middle East or something like that. Yet we do prepare for it. I think it's a question to recognize that there is uncertainty, that we can prepare for it, and that, yes, it is something that you need to take into account. Now, there are certain guidelines there. For instance, the precautionary principle says that, well, if we have a certain uncertainty, things could go bad, things could go okay, or things could go actually better. Well, then prepare for the worst. Make sure that you don't end up in a situation where you said, oh, we made the wrong choice because we didn't want to deal with the uncertainty. So I think politicians, policymakers need to take also their own responsibility to say, well, we live in an uncertain world, whether it is about foreign policy, whether it is about criminality or migration, everything is uncertain. Yet politicians do deal with that, policymakers do deal with that. It's the same thing, they will have to deal with uncertainty in the science. And I think at least what we do as scientists, we try to actually constrain our uncertainty. We try to say, well, is it 10%, is it 20%? So I think we can qualify that, and particularly with water, the concept is that we really have to go for adaptive management of water resources, so that as the science gets better, as we reduce the uncertainty, we can actually account for that in the way we manage our water resources. So we have to also have this adaptive view. The world is changing, the world is more globalizing, and our policies should also be adapting to that reality.
Absolutely, yeah. So at a conference like this, what's the value? What's the value of the Canadian Science Policy Conference? What is it we're getting out of this that's really important?
Well, we're at least starting a conversation between the policy side and the science side. And so this is the first time I come to one of these conferences, and what I did notice here is the enormous amount of energy that the conference it really emanates. And so you see a lot of eagerness from people that are more on the policy side to learn what the scientists have to say, and vice versa. What the scientists are very excited about, saying, hey, we now finally have people in front of us that are making the effort of actually trying to understand when we're dealing with uncertainty, what does it mean, how we translate that into policy, etc. So I think that the importance of a conference like this one is really to bring the two communities together and say, well, maybe this is a good model of how we should do science-informed policy. We need to be able to talk to each other. We need to acknowledge that we come from different cultures, different ways of looking at the world, different perspectives, but they complement each other. And so I've been extremely excited by coming to this conference. Well, not excited from coming to this conference, but I'm very excited because I do see these conversations going on. I see people mingling. I see people trying to really make the effort to go across this bridge. And I think in our panel session, we definitely really emphasize the importance of having these boundary organizations or people doing boundary work in between the science and the policy, really trying to bridge that gap, really trying to basically translate back and forth what does it mean in terms of what is that scientific knowledge bringing to the policy side, but also what does the policy side need, how can we better tailor some of the technical information or the scientific information or scientific knowledge so that it becomes actually more relevant in terms of the policy.
Right. And one final question, where should people go if they're really loving all of this conversation?
Well, I think what we're seeing, for instance, in Waterloo, we have we had a great initiative. It started about 7 years ago by creating what we call a Water Institute. And the Water Institute is really, it's amazing. We have about 150 faculty members that are member of this institute, and it really covers this whole range of pure science via engineering to social science to people that are really practitioners. And I think at least you see, for instance, at universities, and particularly at the University of Waterloo, we're really making this effort to make these transdisciplinary institutes, and I think the biggest benefit is for the students, because they can basically take classes where all these various aspects are discussed, and they're being exposed to the reality of doing science, doing policy, and how do you cross over from one to another.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming to the conference. Thanks for this session.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.